what is it that got you going in the first place?
Curiosity. When I started, I was with the police relations team, and I got to deal with all the CSU students, faculty, and staff that got thrown in jail for usually nocturnal activities, the drunk tank. And one night, my partner said, "Hey, this kid's in a colt over here." Well, coming from a ranch, a colt meant a small horse. I didn't know he was talking a colt. And then 2 weeks later, the 900 people died in Jagoza, Guyana, in Jonestown. So that just got me curious because I saw a lot of religious stuff, and that didn't get it for me. So I want to look at it more from a criminal, psychological, sociological perspective. And so I saw a need there that wasn't being met. So that's how I got involved. That's why I started researching way back then.
So what have you learned over the years from that point of view, the criminal, psychological, and sociological perspective?
What have I learned? I've learned that I don't know a whole lot. I've mainly hit the tip of the iceberg. I mean, I've been doing this 30 years, and every time I think I got a pattern down, the next case that comes in the door blows it out of the water. When you're dealing with human beings, you cannot plug in A and always get B. Every case is individual, as there are so many variables. How did a person get in? What was the group like when it was in? How was it for that person getting out? Are they readjusting? How was the family situation? I mean, there are so many variables to look at this thing. The people, how they get sucked in, how they get out. Every single person has a different story, even out of the same group. So it's very individualized.
Then how does a cult get started?
Some of them are just con men from the start. Some it's a slow progression. See, what happens in a lot of groups, especially the ones that are closed societies, is the cult leader is almost as much of a victim, almost as much of a victim as the cult members themselves, because they're buying into their own stuff, and they don't have a measuring stick to the outside world either through all this controlled activity. So you can start off being not as cuckoo on one extreme, and then slowly get into to where you're just out there. Good example of that is Jim Jones. A lot of people didn't know that Jim Jones was the foreman of the Mendocino County Grand Jury.
Really?
They also didn't know he won the Martin Luther King Humanitarian Award. Before he started going on his little trip, he got further and further out there. By being isolated himself, he was buying into his own propaganda. So you have that. You have just about anything you want. We have, I would guess, this is a Halism. A lot of Halisms here. We got about 37 people that think they're the Messiah. Being a little warped myself, I would like to get all 37 of these people in one room and let them fight it out, see which Messiah wins. I think it'd be great fun to sell tickets. But you have some that are true believers too. And it's a whole different thing for somebody that's also been born and raised in a multi-generational group than somebody that's recruited in, because you had to deal with it from start to finish. You remember some of the ones we had at that conference, but you can take multi-generational clan groups. Grandpa was in the clan, Pa was in the clan, I'm in the clan, by God my son will be in the clan too. You get that sort of thing as well. And the polygamy groups can go back to at least about 100 years.
And you were referring to the Ku Klux Klan.
That's right.
Are there any checks and balances in place that weren't in place after Jonestown, and then we had the Heaven's Gate suicides?
No.
There's nothing in place, so nothing's to stop this happening again?
No. People talk about it and get erased, but the problem is, it's just like any kind of criminal case. You can't arrest somebody because you think they're dirty. I mean, they have to be caught in the act. If they start talking and being a little strange, that's worth noting, but you can't act upon it until they actually do something. And that's the way our criminal system works.
But you have intent. You can have somebody brought to account for their intent to
If you're plotting a bomb or doing an assassination or a mass suicide, if you know ahead of time, then you can probably do that. But a lot of these groups aren't going to exactly telegraph those activities. So it's very difficult for law enforcement. It's far easier on the prevention side than trying to get somebody out or actually stop a group from doing something. It's far easier to keep 100 people from going into a group than getting one out.
Sure. Yeah.
So before we get into the prevention, can we just go back to the 57 messiahs?
Sure.
Please.
I'll just want everybody to know Sun Myung Moon. He's probably one of the biggest ones. We have a lot of small personality groups. And these are groups that don't have a name, they don't have a theology, but it's based on their own individual charismatic type thing. For example, if you have sex with me, I'll give you good vibes. But if you have sex with Bob over here, he'll give you bad vibes. And by the way, God told me how to spend your money. Then some of these guys start buying into, they're getting messages from God or their toaster oven, and off they go. So we got a lot of personality groups. But yeah, there's a bunch of people out there like that.
Can you tell us more about Sun Myung Moon?
Well, Sun Myung Moon, his big thing was, and you'll find this with some of these guys, especially the Bible-based ones. Jesus didn't fulfill or finish the work, so he's here to finish the work or carry on Jesus' work. That's where you see most of the Messiah stuff come out of, is more of the Bible-based type things. And Sun Myung Moon, has been preaching for a long time. He is actually the new Messiah.
And do we have any idea what kind of numbers are involved?
Well, that's true with all these groups. There's no census out there that says, are you in this group? Just like we don't really know how many people are actually in the Ku Klux Klan. How many times do you wear the bed sheets? How many crosses do you light a month? There's no... You can only interpolate, really, from ex-members and anecdotal stories to get some sort of educated guess at the actual numbers.
With your expertise on hate groups, and that bridges into cults as per se, that may not appear to be hate groups per se, they're perhaps passive aggression, hidden hate. Where do you see that line?
The method and operational tactics in these groups really don't. You can change the name of the group, but the tactics and some of the recruiting is identical. Where you see some difference is how closed are these societies. Do you have the outside world to contact with? You separate from family and friends. In other words, how isolated are you in this group? And that doesn't have to be religious. It can be a hate group. For example, you don't want to deal with the outside world because it's all Jewish-controlled press. So you get only your information from me as the leader. And you have some groups that, of course, carry that to extremes. And it doesn't matter if it's a political group or a religious group. Satan can take the same place as the Jewish-occupied government. I mean, it's just a label.
Or the grey man, so forth.
Yeah.
I mean, what happens in RSE particularly is a seeded mistrust of everything and anything outside of the so-called, teachings and
sure.
Current, mode of thought.
Yeah.
It's not hate per se, is it? It's not hate we're talking about with RSE. It's a kind of mistrust and distrust of everything outside.
Yeah. And it's a way to control your measuring stick to reality. Well, that's more of a critical thinking issue, where you get somebody that you can't question, you can't judge against outside, contact. You don't have any way to balance that. So critical thinking is involving a lot of questioning. And if you aren't allowed to question and look at different things, then you really aren't in a position of what's going on inside the group.
But is there some process that occurs in the group that subtly discourages critical thinking?
Well, sure. There's a lot of different things. The best one is the guilt type trips. For example, if you question the group, it's you that has the problem. It's always turned back on the member. It's never the group leader. It's never the group itself is ever doing anything wrong. You see, and that's a good red flag right there between a healthy group and a non-healthy group. A non-healthy group will allow criticism and controversy and that sort of thing. A non-healthy group will shut down all questions about the group at all. And it's always turned back. You aren't being holy enough. You don't want to make the world a better place. You aren't fighting for your race. It's always turned back on the individual.
So a healthy group will allow questioning.
That's right.
How do you know?
They may not like it, but they'll allow it.
I'm questioning. I'm always trying to look at how, from my own personal experience, how I went into that conversion moment from being a skeptic to being an accepting believer, or suspending my disbelief. What do you know of that process?
It is such an individual. There is no way anybody that's worth their salt is going to give you this is how it always works for all people all the time. If I'm going to target somebody, I'm going to find out their background, and I'm going to develop a recruitment strategy around what I think you're looking for. And it's going to be different than what you're looking for, than what you're looking for, and what you're looking for. And I'm going to specifically target that. It could be you just lost a girlfriend, boyfriend, so all of a sudden you have female-male companionship hanging around you. You may be in a place of short-term or acute depression, whatever that is. We'll address that need at that time. No, it's to get your foot in the door. And then I'm going to involve more and more time. Always more meetings, always more classes, always more things to do, to where I'm limiting your time to exposure to the outside. And then as I gain more of your time and gain more of your trust, and the friendships start developing in there, it becomes almost cyclic. But it's not the same for everybody.
Have you heard of a fellow called Derren Brown?
Doesn't ring a bell.
He's a British entertainer come illusionist. He kind of demonstrates the power he can have over people's minds and awareness, and he does it very well. So I've got a video you can have of his work.
Yeah, he does some, and the other guy that I have actually talked to and watched him do something is a guy called the Amazing Randy.
Yeah.
And he puts out some very interesting stuff.
Yeah.
There's another Bob Fellows that did that too.
Well, fellows,
And he's another professional magician, and he shows people how they can get hooked into these groups. But yeah, those things can be a little more dramatic. Most of these groups are a little more subtle, and it's over a period of time. Depends on the group, and that's what I mean. You cannot broad brush this thing at all. When I first got into this, and this is one thing I did learn over 30 years, is this is not easy stuff. And I thought, oh, first year, oh, this is going to be easy. And as I got into it more and more complicated, more cross-discipline type stuff that you need to understand to do this. This is a field where you need to know and like to read. New publications are out all the time. So anyway, it's such a complicated thing that I've devoted 30 years to it, and I don't call myself a master of it at all. Nobody is.
Can you give us an example of a cross-discipline?
Sure. Psychological, criminal, and at the same time statistical research. All those kinds of things come into play. And if you're really going to do a good analysis of this thing. So you become kind of a voracious reader, and there's a lot of crap out there, and there's some good stuff out there, and over time you learn, oh, this is just nutty and not backed up or anywhere. And you're also going to find out that the legitimate stuff and the people that are in this field that are more legit, we're all going to network. We're going to know each other.
And can you say anything about the interest that the government takes in?
Government takes more interest in the monetary stuff, like internal revenue fraud, Department of Revenue type stuff, more tax fraud, money laundering. Government's going to get more involved in that. And of course, if you're dealing with the federal government, it has to be pretty much an interstate crime. Most of the law enforcement agencies are going to stay with the local stuff. And most of the violent cases, white collar crime, that sort of thing, is going to be more of a local jurisdiction. But anytime you get stuff with the tax type things, and they tend to get a little more interested.
There's a lot of talk or paranoia about government involvement and experiments on mind control on the public. Even in RSE, some have even speculated, well, maybe that's a CIA experiment to see how far they can push human beings. I know it's
not there. First of all, they don't have the resources and the manpower, and everything. If you take a look at what's going on in intelligence agency, more and more is electronic and satellites and less human intelligence type stuff.
Right. But surely they must have a branch that does.
They probably have. They do have a branch that deals with human
sociology
and that kind of thing. But in terms of using the public at large for these kind of things, that would take an awful lot of money, an awful lot of agents, an awful lot of researchers, and there's no budget for something like that.
Right.
You know, the old thing, follow the money. The money's not there. It's not going to happen.
Sure.
So I think they give these guys a lot more credit than credit's due.
Another scare tactic.
Sure.
Yeah, you know, there's a lot of the stuff that goes on in RSE is developing so-called psychic abilities, as if that connects you to some greater experience of God, I guess. But this is talk, you know, this idea that if you have, for instance, abilities for remote view, that will you'll become a much more greater person and a more powerful person. But they often talk about, well, this is what these people that are controlling you have. That's how they can control you in society. They have these abilities, and you know, if you develop these.
There's a lot of these things. Some people will consider the whole speaking in tongue things, and kind of along the same line that you see in some of the evangelical churches. Laughter in the spirit, that sort of thing. A lot of psychic phenomenon. Those are all really, from my opinion, is more control techniques than anything.
Is this work you do connected to anything in you spiritually, or is it?
No, because I don't deal with this on a spiritual level. This is a criminal, psychological, sociological thing.
A moral?
I don't care what people call it.
Ethics and morals is to have that in.
Yeah, absolutely.
How does a cult leader get started?
That's like asking, how does a used car salesman get started? Any and all. Some start out being true believers, some are slow, some look at, hey, this is a great way to get chicks and money. Others, it's a control thing. Any and all. Any and all. There's no one path. Just like, and all of a sudden, that's what made it so difficult over 30 years. There's no one path to anything.
Is it your impression that most cult leaders are intentional about what they're doing?
I'd say the majority of them are. Not all of them. Some didn't start out, I don't think, that way, but grew over time. But I think a lot of them are intentional.
And are you aware of any occult legislation on the state or federal level?
Other countries are a little more hardcore, if you want to call it, about the freedom of religion. I mean, in this country, we got anti-freedom of religion that's kind of almost gone too overboard, allowing too much of this stuff. Other countries have, you have freedom of religion, but, within acceptable boundaries. And, but I don't see that changing here in the near future.
So are the hate groups that you're familiar with, they consider themselves to be religions?
Not all of them. Most of them don't. Most of them, it's a racial thing. Like one, for example, your race is your religion. So, and you have other extremists that have political bents, pseudo-communist type bent, or whatever it is that they're pressing.
And how are the children in hate groups educated?
Usually homeschool. And I don't, this is not anti-homeschool, because I think homeschool definitely has a place. It's just with a homeschool where, you know, you don't want those Jew teachers or those black teachers teaching your kids, so you do it everything at home. So you throw in a good dose of racism right behind the arithmetic lessons. So that's why you see a lot of homeschool on that.
I heard that the Moonies now are not actually canvassing, propagating outside of their groups now, because the next generation within the groups are coming forward, so they're self-propagating.
Somewhat, yeah. It's hard to get a handle on that. They're having some problems too, because Moon's getting pretty old, and his sons have been in trouble. There's someone supposed to take it over, wound up being in a cocaine rehab for drug abuse, and he's quite a user. So you can't have the divine throne go to that. So they got a lot of damage control they got to make, and a number of other things. There's a woman that was married to this guy that just wrote a book. I forget what her name, what the book is, but it's all the inside scoop on what happens in the Moon organization, and it is fascinating. It's good stuff.
A website, it's called Enlightenment, and there's a lot of information shared from insider experiences. But often that comes up in some of the threads there is people asking for advice. You know, I've got a boyfriend, just, you know, been involved, I've got a daughter, or whatever. What do you advise for somebody on the outside that can see somebody slipping into this or is totally caught up?
Well, actually the best thing to do is get a hold of an ex-member site that are ex-members of the same group, if that's possible, and chat with them. Because again, this is an individual thing. You can always come to this center and read books and things, but there's nothing like hearing it from somebody who's been in the same group. And so to sit down and chat with them direct, how deeply do you think this person's involved? Is there a way to curtail this, or what information might be useful in this particular case? Now again, trying to broad brush this isn't going to happen. Just isn't going to be there.
There's such a thing as counseling, as you know, and
there's counseling, and like when they come in here, the quote-unquote counseling I give is I give them a reading list, and I talk to them, hey, if you're going to do this and talk about this group, you all need to research and study the same stuff and have kind of a unified message. And therefore, talking to someone like Roseanne down in Denver is very helpful, because that's what she does with families. Coming up and researching with books, and is this really a problem group, or is it just something different? You need to know that first, because we get a lot of calls here about groups that are not destructive, they're just different. And I have to tell people that, hey, you know, it may not be your same faith that you're into, but that doesn't mean it's violent and destructive. So, you know, have to take that too. So you gotta, I guess the first step is find out what exactly is the group that you're talking about, and then research it and see if this thing has a track record or not.
Sure. Just like a product on the market that's suspect,
That's right.
You Google it and see what reviews.
See what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, mental health is not just kicking the tires on a car. You know, it takes a little work and a little effort.
What makes a group violent and destructive?
Usually the group leader. Group leader gets this idea that, oh, we all need to arm up, the outside world's coming to get us, or they make a target, and they say, well, let's go get this target. It's a way to control the group too. You know, let's go get the Jews, let's go get whoever. And so they will act upon that and build pipe bombs and whatever else.
And can you tell us about some of the books on your reading list?
Oh, gosh. How much time do we have?
Yeah.
There's a number of good books. There's one that's called Influence by Cialdini. I don't think I pronounced his name right. Maybe it's Cialdini. And that's good on social influence. And I don't care if you're talking about a destructive group or a used car. You know, there's ways social influencing, and knowing how you're being influenced like that is a real key. So that's a good book. Take Back Your Life is a good book. The Psychology of Totalism that Robert J. Lifton wrote is a good book. There's a number of really good ones out there. It depends how depth you want to get into. Steve Hassan, some of his like Combating Cult Mind Control, is a good primer for somebody just started that doesn't know anything about it. That's a good book. There's all sorts of books out there. But build yourself a little library and contact other people, whether it be me or others in this field, because we all have kind of our favorites, and build your own little library.
And can you tell us what exactly is mind control?
Well, mind control is more or less another influence type mechanism. And that can be reshaping everything from critical thinking to sensory perception. And it can be all wrapped up in a nice neat little package called mind control. Some people will call it behavior mod. Some people will call it resocialization. What it basically boils down to is a form of influence.
And what would be an example of sensory deprivation?
What you're experiencing isn't real. You know, it's, the outside world is making you perceive that. I have the real stuff over here. It's pretty much discounting your experiential stuff.
What takes place in RSE is physical deprivation. You know, it can be food, it can be sleep.
Sure.
And excessive exercise, different so-called sacred disciplines, until you're pretty much entering a altered state just out of exhaustion.
Well, it's also a physiological thing that if you get somebody tired up and you give them a high starch, low protein diet, not only do their motor skills go down, but the critical thinking goes down too. That's a normal physiological state, and any bodybuilder or exercise person will tell you that. That's all wrapped up together.
So let's give an example of what maybe critical thinking is. Critical thinking would go 2 and 2 make 4.
Yeah, it's also questioning. Hey, does 2 and 2 actually equal 4?
Okay.
If I have 2 things, I get 2 things. Did they really make 4? Can you question that?
And when you accept 2 and 2 make 5, then you've entered into this, you know, abandonment of your own.
Yeah, you're not able to question and reason.
Yeah. And then that opens the door to letting go of moral, ethical reasoning.
Can be, yeah.
And
Yeah,
then,
anything can be carried to an extreme. And one thing I want to point out too is when we're talking about extreme and these kinds of things, you know, the old bell-shaped curve, we're talking about the very tail end of these things.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about critical thinking in our culture, even outside of cults?
It's a tool that isn't really practiced as much as it should be. I mean, if I see one more reality show, I mean, that really isn't reality at all. Come on, how can someone be alone on the island with 5 sets of cameras and a boom mic in front of them? You know, give me a break. You know, we don't practice it as well as we should, and a lot of that is just being good consumers too. You know, it kind of goes hand in hand. So that's why that influence book that Cialdini wrote, I think, is real good for everybody to read, not just people dealing with destructive groups.
Hal, there's a lot of fear for people to just perhaps even regain their critical thinking and then realize, hey, this doesn't add up, and then the fear comes up to express that.
Yeah.
And Yalm is particularly in that space. That people know there's things, you know, ethically, morally, and everything else it's just wrong. And I often have them say to me, you know, I don't want to get in a pissing match, there's nothing to do with me, I'm out of there anyway. What do you say to that kind of situation?
Probably they haven't fully recovered from their experience. And that's why I think somebody coming out in this group, it's real important for them to talk to ex-members, work with ex-member work networks, kind of these workshops we did on Estes Park. That's real important. We got a lot of walking wounded out there, and just because you left a group, maybe you haven't really fully left the group if you know what I mean, in terms of the psychological programming that you've been through. And some people get along fine, and I'm not going to say this is true of all people. Some people get out and they get on with their lives and they adjust fine, but that's not true across the board. There's some people that wrestle with this monkey on their back for, decades, and everybody's very different. There's a different experience inside the group for a lot of people.
Do you think most of the fear is unfounded?
It depends how high up you are in the group. But the lower level you are, yes, the more unfounded it is, because you may feel dirty and all that, but the group isn't going to come after you unless you have something of value. If you know the inner workings, if you know how the finances run, and you can expose it.
And that will you be targeted?
Then you would be more susceptible to them trying to make your life hell. But if you're a low-level member, you weren't involved in that, you may feel guilty, you may be looking over your shoulder, but the reality is they're not going to invest time and money when they're not going to get something out of you.
And what about turning that around and ex-members suing the cult leader?
If it's real important for anybody doing this sort of thing to do that, is make sure you get every little scrap of documentation you can get at. It's also, it's very cathartic to maybe go after the group, but you have to get your ducks in a row too. Take your time and deal with other ex-members that may have done the same thing, or better yet, pull together and do a class action suit. Make sure you get a good attorney. And if you don't have an attorney that is necessarily familiar with cults, get one that's willing to be educated about it. And take the time and learn about this stuff. Then it might be worthwhile. It depends on the individual, depends on the group. For example, if you're going after an event that happened 20 years ago, all you're going to do is be frustrated and angry at the system, because you're not going to get very far. So it's more important for an individual to deal on their own recovery issues rather than going after the group leader at that point. It's so different for everybody. Again, you can't broad brush it. I don't know how many times I can say that, but it's going to be very different for every person.
Well, how about prevention?
Teaching people there's no such thing as a free lunch is the hardest thing in the world to teach someone. Hardest thing in the world to teach a human being is common sense. No such thing as a free lunch. If something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Don't treat your mental health and things like this by the same way you do by kicking tires on a car. And research stuff. Your mind is precious. And take care of it. Check references. Don't go off of a strange group unless you know who it is, what its beliefs are. Know you're free to leave when you want. Who's sponsoring it? What's expected of you? A lot of those kinds of things. But the other thing we could do is be better friends to each other. A lot of people that get sucked up in these groups many times are going through what I call short-term depression. And we all have been there. And when we think back during that time, did we say or do something that later we regretted? We've all done that. And a good recruiter is going to pick up on that. But if we're all good friends to each other, especially with the adolescents, this is more for the adolescents than anybody. It's important to do that. And that would help a lot.
This country is particularly open for that so-called freedom of speech.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like JZ Knight abuses that under the freedom of religion, practicing
Yeah.
religion. But she covers herself, she's a for-profit corporate business.
Yep.
Yet she'll also be protected under the umbrella of a church or freedom of religion.
Yep.
How can that be? How can people get away with that? I'm sure they couldn't do that in certain other countries.
No, and we're too liberal in this country on it.
That's it. We're just too liberal. That's it. How can we change that?
Legislation. And most legislatures won't touch a freedom of religion issue.
Till there's a few more Jonestowns, and maybe they'll think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I don't have the magic answer to that either. How liberal do you need to be and still protect, and you still want to be able to, people that are strange and different, to be left alone to be able to do what they want, versus somebody that's destructive. And then I don't have that magic formula, and someone a lot smarter than me will have to come up with that.
Perhaps one of the formulas could be for if they're teaching something and they're claiming this is what you will learn, goods and services, you're paying money, then let's see the results. And even if it's some metaphysical power, spiritual power, then if they're not producing a student that produces that, surely, like any school, they ought to be shut down if they're not producing what they're saying, they're claiming to provide.
Well, another thing is, you know, most of your legitimate religions aren't charging an arm and a leg to go to their church and sermons, unlike Scientology and JZ Knight and some of these others that just charge horrific amounts of money. You know, maybe there's a dividing line there somewhere.
Through Yelm, maybe 8 years ago or less, it was called Omega, and pretty much run by a fellow called Clyde Hood, who's now in prison. He's an aging guy, he's probably got the rest of his days now in prison now. He eventually, after getting caught by the government agencies, got convicted of fraud, mail fraud, and that swept through Yelm for several years, promoted at RSE, and he actually visited Yelm at one time, but that's been pretty much covered up. It's like it never happened. But
of course.
there were hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled through that scam, through Yelm, actually through, if you like, the encouragement of RSE, particularly, you know, Ramtha.
Yeah.
So there are, you know, areas that could be, government could investigate tax fraud.
No, I think so. That's again, if you approach them on that kind of a thing, rather than, oh, she's just awful doing this, but if you hit them on the pocketbook, and you talk about pocketbook issues and lost revenue to the state, they take more notice.
Yeah, that was, you know, Omega is just one of quite a few that have come through. It seems to be a mecca of scam artists come through, even speaking at the school, promoting some product, and it lasts a year or two, and then they're gone, you don't hear of them again, then there's a new product comes through. It's constant in Yale particularly. It's a marketing, you know,
Yep.
it seems a scammer's paradise to market something crazy under the umbrella of
Sure.
something spiritual or, you know, to better mankind.
Have you noticed that as a connection?
I'd say a lot of them will use anything if they can make money at it and they can get their hands into it, whether it's just another scam or not. If they think they can get some use out of it, they will. I don't know if it's necessarily any one particular group over another. It's just what falls in their lap at the time.
So the kind of person we're talking about is someone who really lacks a sort of conscience.
Almost a sociopathic type thing, yeah. Well, sociopathics very rarely have little remorse for what they do. They don't really acknowledge, what it is they do is necessarily wrong or care.